Hello, this is Mr. Detonicord, and this topic is going to introduce you to the subject of ecology. So we'll start off with what is ecology, and of course ecology is the study of interactions in an environment. And there are two main types of interactions that we're interested in. One, the interactions between organisms, such as a predator and a prey. That's one type of interaction. And we also have interactions between the organism and the non-living parts of an ecosystem. One example could be air pollution and its effects on human respiration. Now, there's many examples of each one of these things, and all of these could be things that an ecologist would study. So, what is an ecosystem? And an ecosystem is a place where all the living and non-living things are in an area where the biotic and abiotic factors are interacting. And the size of the ecosystem really kind of depends on the scientist who's studying it. The ecosystem could be as small as a puddle if they're studying the interactions of the microorganisms that are in it, or it could be the size of the whole planet if you're studying something like the global warming, for example. In ecology, we could specialize at a certain level, what we call the levels of organization. And we could study things at each one of these levels. So let's find out what they are. First of all, we could start with an individual organism. You could study the individual organism's behavior. You could study a group of those individuals, because a group of them make a population. So a group of just one kind of individual, like this elk, make up a population. So if we have a group of populations, then we have a community. So a community includes all kinds of living things, not just one type of species. Now, if we combine the living things with the non-living parts of the environment, that's when we have an ecosystem. And then if we look at an ecosystem that has a specific climate and specific types of plants and animals that live there, that's when we come to something like a biome, for example, like a rainforest or a desert. And then if we combine all of the biomes of the Earth, that is finally when we arrive at the biosphere. Okay, so what are biotic and abiotic factors? Well, it's pretty simple. Abiotic factors are non-living parts of the environment, and biotic factors are living parts of the environment. Abiotic factors have never lived, are not dead, or are parts of living things, or are not parts of living things. Biotic factors are living or have lived before, or they can be dead, or they can be parts of living things. So examples of abiotic factors, of course, water, sunlight, minerals, temperature, carbon dioxide, air, lightning, and landforms. Biotic factors would be like plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, leaves, trees, acorns, and fur. Notice fur, even though it's not a living thing, it's part of a living thing. Also, man-made items are not biotic or abiotic, because they're not found in nature. And so some examples, batteries, video games, etc. Here we have another chart showing some abiotic and biotic factors. So of course the air is all abiotic. We have different molecules in the air. Water, light, wind, soil, pH, temperature, salinity, humidity, inorganic nutrients, and so on. So I think the abiotic things are, fairly straightforward. If you didn't know what salinity was, that would be the amount of salt in the water, like say in the seawater. As far as biotic things, it's not just the organisms themselves. It could also include things like competition. Living things compete all the time for food, water, shelter, and mates. Predation. Symbiosis. Symbiosis is when organisms have some sort of a connection where they affect each other, either sometimes in a helpful way or a harmful way, or maybe in no way at all. Mutualism is a relationship in where both organisms are benefiting from being together in some way. Parasitism would be a harmful interaction where the parasite is harming a host. And then, of course, disease. So these are biotic factors that would and could affect other biotic factors. Here we take an example of an alligator and how the biotic factors and abiotic factors come into play. So with food availability, alligators' diets consist of fish, frogs, and invertebrates. So if they are the predator of these organisms, they would cause these populations to decrease if they're eating lots of them. Competition. Alligators compete with snapping turtles and herons for the food of the other alligators. They compete with snapping turtles and herons for food, and they compete with other alligators for space, food, and mates. So there are interactions there. Competition. Disease. Diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, or fungi can affect alligators like any other organism. Parasites, such as flatworms, can also affect the alligator. Plants, like bald cypress, swamp gum, lily pads, provide shade, protection, and habitats for prey. They recycle nutrients and absorb carbon dioxide and provide oxygen. On the abiotic side, the temperature of the air and water is an important thing for the alligators. Alligators are cold-blooded, so they need to have certain temperature ranges. Climate, the amount of rainfall, humidity, wind, all affect the alligator's activity. Sunlight, the intensity as well as the length of the day and night will have an effect on the alligators. Oxygen availability, obviously they need oxygen for respiration. pH and salinity could affect its drinking water supply and also indirectly in terms of food availability and plant activity. Alright, take a look at this image and I want you to pick out 5 abiotic factors in this environment and list them. And then pick out 5 biotic factors and list them. This is Cindy Tonicourt, and we're here to discuss the characteristics of life. All living things share some basic properties, including cellular organization, because all living things are made of cells. Reproduction, all living things must reproduce. Metabolism, which means that all living things must obtain energy and use energy. Homeostasis, this means that all living things have to maintain a constant internal environment. One simple example would be like your body temperature, staying stable at around 98.6 degrees. Heredity. We have to pass on our genes because our DNA holds the genetic information that gives us the characteristics that we have. Responsiveness. All organisms respond to their environment in some way. Growth and development. Of course, we know that we grow and we get larger. So do other organisms, plants, animals, and so on. But organisms also develop, which means they change over time as they mature. And they adapt through evolution. So over time, organisms change and become more adapted to their environments. Alright, let's take a look at these in a little more detail. The smallest possible living thing is a cell. And a couple of examples of this are bacteria and protists. Here you can see this is a protist called a paramecium. And here we have some bacteria. We can also have multicellular organisms, organisms that are made of many cells, and they have to have specialized cells because it's not just one general cell doing all of the jobs. You need to have a lot of different cells that are capable of doing very specific jobs, which can all help the organism to survive. Here are some plant cells, and here are the inside of a plant cell. You can see that there are a lot of what we call organelles, little organelles that can do specific jobs to help the cell to survive. All living things reproduce. So there are a couple of ways you can reproduce. Or some organisms reproduce asexually, and some reproduce sexually. In this case, we have a single parent, and it reproduces by cell division. So you can see here this cell divided into another cell. That's asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, we have two different parent organisms, and they contribute their own genetic information. This involves a male and a female sex cell. So typically mating. In the case of plants, you could just have one parent, but still two different sex cells. All living things obtain and use energy. Living organisms need energy to grow, develop, repair damage, and to reproduce. Basically, you need energy for all of your life functions. There are two ways of looking at energy in an organism's body. One is called anabolism, and that's the process of building up complex substances from simpler substances. Building up cells and cellular components, and photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is anabolism because this leaf can capture sunlight, use the energy from the sunlight to produce sugars, which is food for the plant. So it's building a new molecule from the carbon dioxide from the air and from the energy from the sunlight. It can make sugars. On the opposite side of that, we have catabolism. And that's a process of breaking down complex substances into simpler substances to release energy. This would be like digestion and cellular respiration. So when you eat food, you digest it, and it goes into your bloodstream, and it goes to all the cells of your body. Your cells can then use those simple sugars as a source of energy by doing a process called cellular respiration. And it breaks down that sugar, and it uses it for energy. It makes ATP molecules, which your cell can use to do work. Metabolism. This is the total of all of the chemical reactions in your body, or in an organism's body. It includes the anabolism plus the catabolism. So basically, an easy way to think about this is all of the chemical reactions in your body in subtotal become your metabolism. So you're constantly using energy to do your body's work, and therefore you have to constantly take in energy to replace that. All organisms maintain homeostasis, and that is how the organism's body maintains a constant internal environment. Things like body temperature, blood volume, pH balance, water balance, and if any of these things were to really go out of whack, it could mean serious problems for the organism. So even with body temperature, if your body temperature even goes up a fairly small amount, you could get very sick, fever, and possibly even die. Same thing with pH balance. Your blood has a fairly constant pH. If you were to do something like binge drink and really tax your system, you could actually change your pH so much it can kill you, and that's a big problem with alcohol poisoning. All organisms pass along hereditary traits. Genes carry hereditary information. Genes are composed of DNA, and heredity is the reason children resemble their parents. There can be mutations to DNA, and those mutations can also be passed on to the next generation. All living things respond to their environment. Organisms react to stimuli such as light, temperature, odor, sound, gravity, heat, and water, and pressure. Here in this example, we typically don't think of plants as moving very much, or they don't move around like animals do. But really, they do respond to their environment, and they tend to grow toward the sunlight. So they are aware of their environment, and they can react to it. All organisms grow. That's pretty obvious. Every living thing that you see, you can probably think of as having grown. And then they develop, which means that they change over time. So like an example of a butterfly changing from a caterpillar changing into a butterfly. But even with something like a human, obviously you go through different stages of development, from an infant to a toddler to a child to an adolescent to an adult and to a senior citizen. All living things adapt to their environment through evolution. So adaptation is a process that enables organisms to become better suited to their environment. Organisms have a lot of different characteristics, what we call variations. And when one of these variations actually helps an organism to survive in the environment that it's in, it can become an adaptation. And adaptations are very important for helping organisms to survive in very different environments. Species obtain these adaptations through evolution over great periods of time. And here are just some time periods. The Earth is pretty old, and organisms have had a long time to adapt over these years. An example of an adaptation is this cactus has to adapt to living in a very dry environment, and so it's developed a waxy coating to help it conserve water. Also, the spines on the cactus have developed to help protect it from predators that would eat the cactus.